There are promises that echo through time, childish declarations that should fade with age, but instead burn like embers in the heart. Alara knows this better than most. At 8 years old, she stood before the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories, a human orphan with nothing to offer but her own unbroken spirit, and dared to claim his future. "I'll marry you when I grow up," she told him, while the court laughed and waited for his wrath. But King Kale didn't strike her down. Instead, he looked at her with golden eyes that saw too much, and told her to return when she was grown. 18 years have carved their story into her skin, a map of scars and survival, of a world that has no place for human orphans or childhood fantasies. Yet here she stands at Blackcrest's gates, the shadow of war at her back, and the weight of an impossible promise around her neck. The little girl is gone, replaced by a woman who has learned that fear is not weakness, and love is not simple. What waits behind those iron gates is not the man she remembers. Power has hardened him, betrayal has sharpened him, and the golden-eyed king who once spared a child's pride now rules with merciless precision. They say his heart froze years ago, that nothing remains of the wolf who showed mercy to a human girl, but Alara knows better. For some bonds transcend time and circumstance, connecting souls across impossible divides. And in a kingdom threatened by encroaching darkness, perhaps the most radical act of courage is not to fight, but to remember what it means to see beyond the surface, to the truth that lies beneath. She has returned to fulfill her promise, to claim a throne, to face a king, and perhaps to save them both. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. Alara stood at the edge of the territory, the harsh winter wind cutting through her travel-worn cloak. 18 years had passed since she'd last seen these mountains, yet they remained as imposing as they were in her childhood memories. The kingdom of Blackcrest loomed ahead, its stone walls rising from the mountainside like teeth from a beast's jaw. "You're mad to return," her traveling companion Nyx muttered beside her. "King Kale has grown more vicious with age, not kinder." Alara's fingers instinctively touched the scar that ran from her collarbone to her shoulder, a permanent reminder of what happened when one challenged a wolf. "I made a promise. A child's promise," Nyx scoffed, adjusting the bow strapped to her back, "made by a little girl who didn't know better." "Perhaps." Alara pulled her hood lower against the biting cold. "But I've never been one to break my word." The memory surfaced unbidden, standing in the great hall at 8 years old, orphaned and alone, staring up at the newly crowned Alpha King. The court had fallen silent when she'd approached the throne, this tiny human child with no clan, no status, and certainly no right to address the most feared wolf in the Northern Territories. "They say you need a queen," she'd declared with a child's innocent audacity. "I'll marry you when I grow up." The court had erupted in laughter, but King Kale hadn't laughed. His golden eyes had narrowed, calculating and cold as he leaned forward on his throne. "Is that so, little one?" His voice had been low, dangerous. "And what makes you worthy of such an honor?" She'd lifted her chin then, unafraid despite the power that radiated from him. "Because I'm not scared of you." The silence that followed had been deafening. Then, to everyone's shock, the corner of the Alpha King's mouth had twitched. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to amusement anyone had seen from him since his bloody ascension to the throne. "Return when you're grown," he'd said, his golden eyes glinting with something unreadable. "If you're still unafraid, perhaps we'll see about that throne." They'd sent her away the next day, to the human settlements beyond the mountains. For her protection, they'd claimed. But Alara knew better. A human child was a liability in a wolf's kingdom, especially one who dared to speak directly to the Alpha. "The gates are opening," Nyx said, pulling Alara from her reverie. Ahead, the massive iron gates of Blackcrest creaked apart, and a small party of riders emerged. Even from this distance, Alara could make out the royal insignia on their armor, the snarling wolf's head that had become synonymous with terror throughout the territories. "King's Guard," Alara murmured, her hand instinctively moving to the dagger concealed at her waist. "They don't usually patrol this far out, unless they're looking for someone," Nyx said pointedly. "Someone like a human woman returning to fulfill a foolish childhood promise." Alara watched the riders carefully. They moved with the fluid grace of shifters, their bodies perfectly attuned to their mounts. "We're not turning back now." "No," Nyx sighed, resignation in her voice. "I suppose we're not." They continued down the mountain path, making no effort to hide their approach. Concealment was pointless against wolf shifters anyway. Their senses were too keen, their instincts too sharp. Better to approach openly than appear to be sneaking into the kingdom. The riders spotted them quickly, changing course to intercept. As they drew closer, Alara could see the lead rider more clearly. A tall woman with copper hair pulled back in a severe braid, her armor marking her as a high-ranking officer. "Halt," the woman commanded as they approached, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of an alpha. "State your business in Blackcrest." Alara lowered her hood, meeting the woman's gaze directly. "I'm here to see the king." The woman's nostrils flared as she scented the air, her eyes narrowing. "A human." She spat the word like a curse. "And what business could a human possibly have with Alpha King Kale?" "My business is with him alone," Alara replied evenly. A low growl rumbled in the officer's throat, her eyes flashing gold, the sign of a wolf close to the surface. "You dare to—" "Commander Lyra," one of the other guards interrupted, his gaze fixed on Alara with a strange intensity. "I know this one." The commander turned to him, brow furrowed. "Explain, Lieutenant Thorne." The man, Lieutenant Thorne, dismounted, approaching Alara cautiously. He was older than the others, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched around his eyes. "The orphan girl," he said, studying her face. "The one who challenged the king 18 years ago." A murmur rippled through the guards. Commander Lyra's expression shifted from contempt to disbelief. "Impossible. That child was sent away, and now she's returned," Alara said quietly. "As promised." Lieutenant Thorne's weathered face cracked into an unexpected smile. "By the moon, it really is you, the little spitfire who made our king speechless." He turned to the commander. "This is the human child who told the Alpha King she would marry him when she grew up." The commander's eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously. "You're that child? The one they speak of in whispers?" "I am." "Then you're either exceptionally brave or exceptionally foolish," Commander Lyra said, her voice cold. "The king is not the man he was 18 years ago. He's harsher," Lieutenant Thorne supplied. "Colder, more dangerous." "I'm aware of his reputation," Alara replied. "I still wish to see him." Commander Lyra studied her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Very well. You'll be escorted to the palace. But I warn you, if this is some scheme, some plot against the crown, you won't leave Blackcrest alive." "I understand," Alara said, maintaining the commander's gaze. They were given horses and surrounded by the guard, more prisoners than guests as they were led toward the gates of Blackcrest. As they rode, Alara felt Nyx's worried gaze on her. "It's not too late to reconsider," her friend whispered. But it was too late. It had been too late from the moment she'd made that childish promise all those years ago. Something had connected her to the Alpha King that day. Something beyond understanding, beyond reason. She'd felt it then, a tether binding her fate to his, and she felt it now, growing stronger with each step toward the kingdom. The gates of Blackcrest loomed before them, dark and imposing against the winter sky. Beyond them lay the city, and beyond that, the palace where King Kale ruled with an iron fist. Alara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Welcome back to Blackcrest," Lieutenant Thorne said quietly as the gates swung open. "May the moon have mercy on your soul." The city had changed since Alara had last seen it. Where once there had been colorful market stalls and laughter, now there were grim-faced citizens hurrying about their business, their eyes downcast, their shoulders hunched. The buildings were grander, the streets cleaner, but there was a heaviness in the air, a tension that hung over the city like a storm cloud. "What happened here?" Alara murmured. "Progress," Commander Lyra answered coldly. "The king's vision for a stronger Blackcrest." They passed through the central square, where a massive statue of a wolf dominated the space. At its base, Alara glimpsed fresh flowers, offerings to the Alpha King, or perhaps prayers for protection from him. The palace rose above the city, a fortress of black stone and iron. It had always been imposing, but now it seemed almost malevolent, its towers reaching toward the sky like claws. As they approached the main gates, Alara felt a flutter of something in her chest. Not fear, but anticipation. After 18 years, she was about to face the Alpha King again. The man whose golden eyes had haunted her dreams for as long as she could remember. The man to whom she'd made a promise as a child. a promise she intended to keep. The palace guards eyed her with open suspicion as she dismounted. Nyx stayed close, her hand never straying far from her weapon. "The king is in council," Commander Lyra informed them. "You'll wait in the antechamber until he's ready to receive you." Her tone suggested she doubted that moment would ever come. They were led through grand hallways adorned with tapestries depicting battles and hunts, the glory of Blackcrest captured in vivid thread and color. Servants scurried past, their eyes downcast, their movements hurried. None dared to look directly at the commander or her charges. The antechamber was opulent but cold, its stone walls hung with more battle tapestries, its floor covered in thick furs. A fire roared in the massive hearth, yet the room somehow remained chilled. "Wait here," Commander Lyra ordered. "Touch nothing. Speak to no one." She paused at the door, her gaze lingering on Alara. "And prepare yourself, human. The king remembers everything." With that, she was gone, leaving Alara and Nyx alone in the cavernous chamber. "This is madness," Nyx hissed as soon as the door closed. "Look at this place. Look at what he's done to the city. This isn't a man you can reason with, Alara." "I'm not here to reason with him," Alara replied, her gaze fixed on the imposing portrait that dominated the far wall, King Kale in his ceremonial armor, his golden eyes fierce, his expression unyielding. "I'm here to fulfill a promise. A child's promise," Nyx reminded her, "made by a different girl to a different man." Alara approached the portrait, studying the face of the king. He was handsome in a severe way, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw, his golden eyes capturing the feral nature of his wolf. There was no kindness in that face, no mercy, only power and a terrible beauty. "Perhaps," she murmured, reaching up to touch the scar at her collarbone. "But some promises transcend time and change. Some bonds cannot be broken." The door to the antechamber swung open with a resounding crash. Alara turned, her heart lurching in her chest. In the doorway stood a tall figure dressed in black, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. King Kale, the Alpha of Blackcrest, the most feared ruler in the Northern Territories, and the man to whom she'd promised herself 18 years ago. His gaze locked with hers, recognition flashing in those golden depths. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she remembered, rougher, but with that same dangerous edge that had both terrified and fascinated her as a child. "So," he said, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The little girl has returned." "The little girl has returned," King Kale repeated, his golden eyes never leaving Alara's face as he stepped into the chamber. The guards behind him remained at the threshold, watching warily. Alara met his gaze steadily, though her heart thundered in her chest. Close up, the years had marked him. A thin scar bisected his right eyebrow, and silver threaded through the temples of his otherwise dark hair. He'd grown broader, too, his shoulders straining against the fine black fabric of his tunic. Power emanated from him like heat from a flame. "Not so little anymore," she replied, her voice calmer than she felt. Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, perhaps, or curiosity. He circled her slowly, scenting the air, studying her as a predator might study unusual prey. Nyx tensed beside her, but Alara remained still, allowing his assessment. "No," he agreed finally. "Not little at all." He stopped in front of her again, close enough that she could feel the unnatural heat that all shifters radiated. "You've grown bold, human, to return to my kingdom after all these years." "I made a promise," Alara said simply. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Ah, yes, your marriage proposal." The words dripped with sardonic amusement. "I remember a fearless child. It seems you've retained that particular quality, at least." Without warning, his hand shot out, fingers wrapping around her wrist. His touch was burning against her skin, his grip firm but not painful. Alara didn't flinch. "Your heart races," he observed, feeling her pulse beneath his thumb. "Yet you show no fear." "Interesting." "Let her go," Nyx growled, taking a step forward. The guards at the door immediately moved, hands on their weapons, but King Kale raised his free hand, stopping them with a gesture. His attention remained fixed on Alara. "Your companion is protective," he remarked, "and foolish, to challenge an alpha in his own den." "Nyx is loyal," Alara corrected. "And yes, protective. A rare quality in these times, I'm told." King Kale released her wrist, his fingers lingering for a moment against her skin. Indeed. He stepped back, assessing them both with that penetrating golden gaze. So you've returned to fulfill your childhood promise, to marry the Alpha King. His tone made it clear how absurd he found the notion. I've returned because I said I would, Alara clarified. The rest remains to be seen. A surprised laugh escaped him, sharp and brief, as though the sound was unfamiliar to his throat. Diplomatic. You've learned caution in your years away. I've learned many things. I'm sure you have. He gestured to the chairs by the fire. Sit. Tell me of these. Many things. It wasn't a request. Alara moved to one of the ornate chairs, Nyx reluctantly taking the seat beside her. King Kale dismissed the guards with a flick of his wrist, then settled into the chair opposite, his posture deceptively casual, though his eyes remained alert, predatory. Where have you been all these years, Alara of no clan? He asked, using the formal address for those without pack or family. The human settlements at first, she answered, then further east, beyond the Silver Mountains. The wild lands. His eyebrows rose slightly. Few survive there, human or wolf. As you said, I've retained certain qualities. And what brought you back? Beyond an impulsive child's promise? His gaze drifted to the scar visible at her collarbone. Surely not fond memories of Blackcrest? Alara felt the weight of his stare on her scar. The East is falling to chaos. The border skirmishes have become all-out war. The refugees speak of dark magic, of entire villages disappearing in the night. And this concerns me how? He asked, though his sudden stillness betrayed his interest. The tide is moving west, Alara said simply. It will reach Blackcrest eventually. King Kale leaned forward, the firelight casting harsh shadows across his face. You crossed the mountains, braved the winter roads, and walked into the den of the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories, to warn me of a threat. I came because of my promise, Alara corrected. The warning is a courtesy. A courtesy, he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Or perhaps a ploy to ingratiate yourself with the crown, to remind me of a moment of weakness years ago, when I humored a child instead of sending her away immediately. Nyx shifted uncomfortably beside her, but Alara held the king's gaze. Is that what it was? A moment of weakness? Something dark passed over his features. You know nothing of me or my kingdom, Alara of no clan. 18 years is a lifetime. The child who stood before my throne might recognize my face, but she would not know the man I've become. Then let me know him, she said quietly. The boldness of her statement seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, the hardness in his eyes gave way to something more complex. Surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect. You will stay as my guest, he declared abruptly, rising from his chair. For now, Commander Lyra will show you to suitable quarters. And my companion? She may stay as well. His gaze shifted to Nyx, cold and assessing. Though I suggest she mind her manners in my court, my tolerance for disrespect is limited. As if on cue, the door opened, and Commander Lyra entered, her posture stiff, her expression carefully neutral. My king? Escort our guests to the East Wing, King Kale ordered. See that they're given whatever they require. He turned back to Alara, his gaze lingering on her face. We will speak again at the evening meal. Perhaps then you can tell me more of these threats from the East. He moved toward the door, then paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. And Alara, the child who made that promise is gone. Remember that before you presume too much on a moment from the past. With that, he was gone, leaving the room suddenly colder despite the roaring fire. Commander Lyra's expression remained impassive, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. You must have made quite an impression, human. The king rarely grants private audiences, let alone invitations to dine. We're old acquaintances, Alara replied, rising from her chair. So it seems. The commander gestured toward the door. Follow me. As they moved through the palace corridors, Alara felt the weight of curious stares from servants and nobles alike. Whispers followed in their wake, speculation about the human woman who had caught the king's attention. Ignore them, Commander Lyra advised without looking back. Court gossip is as venomous as a serpent, and twice as quick. The East Wing was clearly reserved for distinguished guests. Their chambers were spacious and well-appointed, with large windows overlooking the snow-covered palace gardens, and beyond them, the mountain peaks that surrounded Blackcrest. These are generous accommodations, Nyx remarked, eyeing the luxurious furnishings with suspicion. "The king's orders," Commander Lyra replied curtly. "Someone will come to escort you to dinner. Until then, you're free to rest, but I advise against wandering the palace unaccompanied." Her gaze settled on Alara. "Not all in Blackcrest are as tolerant of humans as our king appears to be." Once the commander had departed, Nyx immediately began inspecting the room, checking behind tapestries and under furniture with practiced thoroughness. "Do you really think they'd make it that obvious if they meant to trap us?" Alara asked, amused despite the tension of the situation. "I think," Nyx replied, testing the lock on the window, "that you're being remarkably calm for someone who just challenged the most dangerous alpha in the territories." "I didn't challenge him." "No?" Nyx turned to face her, one eyebrow raised. "What would you call it then?" Alara moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains beyond. "A reminder." "Of what? A child's fancy?" "Alara, look at what he's built here." Nyx gestured around them. "This isn't the court of a merciful king. This is the stronghold of a conqueror. The rumors we heard in the east were just that, rumors." But even as she said it, Alara remembered the fear in the eyes of the city's residents, the oppressive silence that hung over Blackcrest like a shroud. "People don't fear rumors," Nyx countered, as if reading her thoughts. "They fear truths." Alara sighed, turning away from the window. "We're here now, and he's agreed to listen about the threat from the east. That's what matters." "Is it?" Nyx studied her face. "Or is there more to this promise of yours than you've told me?" Before Alara could respond, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. A young servant girl entered, her eyes downcast, carrying a tray of fresh clothing. "For dinner, my ladies," she murmured, setting the tray on a nearby table. "The king thought you might wish to change after your journey." The clothing was finely made, dresses of silk and velvet in deep, rich colors, befitting guests of the royal court. Alara fingered the material, noting the quality. "The king has excellent taste," she observed. The servant girl glanced up briefly, then quickly lowered her gaze again. "He remembers," she whispered, so softly that Alara almost missed it. "Pardon?" The girl looked around nervously, then leaned slightly closer. "The color, the blue dress. It's the same shade you wore that day when you came before the throne." "He remembers." Alara stared at the deep blue dress, a jolt of recognition passing through her. The servant was right. It was the exact shade of the simple dress she'd worn as a child, the day she'd made her bold declaration to the king. "How would you know that?" Nyx asked suspiciously. "I was there," the girl said, her voice barely audible. "I was a child too, helping in the kitchens. Everyone remembers that day, the little human girl who made the Alpha King speechless." She glanced toward the door, clearly anxious. "I shouldn't speak of it. Forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive," Alara assured her. "What's your name?" "Marie, my lady." "Thank you for the clothes, Marie. And for the information." The girl bobbed a quick curtsy and hurried from the room, leaving Alara staring at the blue dress with a strange tightness in her chest. "Well," Nyx said after a moment, "it seems the king has a better memory than you gave him credit for." "So it seems," Alara murmured, running her fingers over the soft fabric. As the afternoon faded into evening, Alara prepared for dinner, with a curious mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She chose the blue dress, of course, a deliberate acknowledgement of the king's subtle message. As she fastened the delicate silver clasps, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The girl who had stood before King Kyle's throne 18 years ago was indeed gone. In her place stood a woman shaped by hardship and survival, her body lean and strong, her eyes carrying shadows that spoke of things seen and endured. The scar at her collarbone was only the most visible of the marks life had left upon her. Yet something of that child remained, in the stubborn set of her jaw, in the unwavering determination that had brought her back to Blackcrest after all these years. "I still don't understand," Nyx said, watching her from across the room. "Why this promise? Why him?" Alara's hand moved to her throat, to the silver pendant she always wore, a small wolf's head, its eyes tiny chips of amber. "Because he saw me," she said softly, "in a world where I was invisible, a human orphan in a kingdom of wolves. He saw me, and that was enough to bring you back after 18 years. "No." Alara turned from the mirror, meeting her friend's concerned gaze. "What brought me back was the knowledge that the threat from the east is real. and that Blackcrest stands in its path. The promise was just the way in. Nyx looked skeptical, but before she could respond, another knock came at the door. "Lieutenant Thorne, come to escort them to dinner. The blue suits you," he remarked, as they followed him through the palace corridors. "Though I suspect you already know that." "The king has a good memory," Alara replied carefully. "The king forgets nothing," Thorne said, his tone neutral, but his eyes conveying a warning, especially slights against his pride. "I never slighted him," Alara countered. The lieutenant chuckled softly. "No? A human child claiming she would marry the Alpha King? Some might call that the greatest slight of all." "Or the greatest compliment," Alara suggested. Thorne glanced at her, something like approval in his weathered face. "You still have that fire, I see. Good. You'll need it." They were led to a private dining room rather than the great hall, a more intimate setting, though no less impressive. The walls were adorned with ancient weapons and shields bearing the royal crest, and a long table of polished black wood dominated the center of the room. King Cale was already there, standing by the large hearth, a goblet of wine in his hand. He turned as they entered, his golden eyes immediately finding Alara, lingering on the blue dress with unmistakable recognition. "Leave us," he commanded, and Lieutenant Thorne bowed, retreating from the room. Nyx hesitated, her protective instincts clearly warring with protocol. "Your companion may stay," King Cale said, correctly interpreting her reluctance. "Though I assure you, if I meant your friend harm, no amount of vigilance on your part would prevent it." "Comforting," Nyx muttered under her breath. The king's sensitive hearing caught the word, and his lips curved into a cold smile. "Truth rarely is, Huntress." He gestured to the table, where 3 places had been set. "Sit, eat, and tell me of this threat from the east that has brought you back to my kingdom after so long." As they took their places, servants appeared silently, bearing platters of roasted meat, winter vegetables, and fresh bread. The food was excellent, but Alara found her appetite diminished by the intensity of the king's gaze, which rarely left her face. "You've changed," he observed abruptly, setting down his wine goblet. "The eyes are the same, but the rest," his gaze trailed to her scar. "Life has not been kind to you beyond our borders." "Life is rarely kind to anyone," Alara replied, "king or commoner." "True enough." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Tell me of the East." So she did. She told him of the villages burned to ash, of the refugees fleeing westward with stories of shadow creatures that came in the night, of the strange sickness that followed in their wake. She spoke of the border patrols that had disappeared without trace, of the unnatural storms that some claimed were conjured by dark magic. "And you believe these tales?" King Cale asked when she had finished, his expression guarded. "I've seen enough to know there's truth in them," Alara answered. "Whatever is happening in the east, it's moving westward. Slowly, but steadily. And you think it will reach Blackcrest?" "I know it will," she said firmly. "The question is whether you'll be prepared when it does." The king's eyes narrowed. "My kingdom has stood against threats for centuries. We are not some weak human settlement to be overrun by shadows and superstition." "This is different," Alara insisted. "This isn't a rival pack or a human army. It's something other. Magic," Nyx added, speaking up for the first time. "Dark magic, of a kind not seen in these lands for generations." King Cale's attention shifted to her. "And you're an expert in ancient magics, Huntress?" "I'm an expert in tracking," Nyx replied evenly. "And whatever's moving through the east doesn't leave tracks like any creature I've ever known." A heavy silence fell over the table. King Cale's fingers drummed against the polished wood, his expression thoughtful. "Let's say I believe you," he said finally. "What would you have me do? Abandon the kingdom my ancestors built? Flee into the mountains like frightened prey?" "No," Alara shook her head. "I would have you prepare. Strengthen your borders. Forge alliances with the neighboring territories." Alliances. The word seemed to leave a bitter taste in his mouth. "The neighboring alphas would sooner see me dead than stand beside me in battle, then change their minds," Alara challenged. "You're the Alpha King. Find a way." His golden eyes flashed with sudden anger. "You presume much, human, to dictate strategy to me in my own hall." "I presume nothing," Alara countered, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I offer counsel, as any loyal subject would to their king." "Loyal subject?" He laughed, the sound sharp and without humor. You, who have been absent from my kingdom for 18 years, you claim loyalty to Blackcrest. I claim loyalty to its people, Alara replied steadily. To the home that sheltered me as an orphaned child before I was sent away. For your protection, King Kale snapped. Was it? Alara asked quietly. Or was it because a human child was an inconvenience in a court of wolves? The air between them seemed to thicken with tension. Nyx shifted uncomfortably beside her, sensing the dangerous territory they were entering. You know nothing of the decisions I've had to make, the king said, his voice low and dangerous. Nothing of the burdens of the crown. Then tell me, Alara challenged. Help me understand the man you've become, so different from the one who once spared a child's foolish pride. Something flickered in his golden eyes, a complex emotion she couldn't quite name. For a moment, the hardness in his face softened, revealing a glimpse of a different man beneath the Alpha King's fierce exterior. Then the moment passed, and his expression shuddered once more. It's late, he said abruptly, rising from the table. We'll speak more of these threats from the east tomorrow. For now, return to your chambers and rest. Blackcrest's hospitality is yours, for as long as you remain useful. Alara stood, disappointment mingling with frustration at his sudden dismissal. As you wish, Your Majesty. As they turned to leave, King Kale's voice stopped them at the door. Alara, she looked back, finding his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The blue does suit you, he said softly. I remember that much, at least. Then he turned away, leaving Alara with the unsettling feeling that beneath the Alpha King's cold exterior, echoes of the man who had once shown mercy to a bold child still remained. The question was whether those echoes were enough to save him and his kingdom from the darkness gathering on the horizon. The following days in Blackcrest revealed a kingdom balanced on a knife's edge. Beneath the surface of order and prosperity, tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. Alara observed it all. The stiff formality of the nobles, the fearful deference of the servants, the harsh discipline of the guards. King Kale ruled with absolute authority, his word unquestioned, his judgment swift and often merciless. Yet Alara caught glimpses of something else in him during their daily meetings, a flash of weariness when he thought no one was watching, a moment of unexpected gentleness toward a child who had stumbled in his path. He wasn't always this way, Lieutenant Thorne told her one morning as they walked through the palace gardens, frost crunching beneath their boots. The war with the southern territories changed him. Too many betrayals, too much blood. War changes everyone, Alara acknowledged, thinking of her own scars, both visible and hidden. Yes, Thorne agreed, his weathered face solemn. But not all changes are for the better. On the 5th day, King Kale summoned Alara to his private study, a vast chamber lined with ancient books and maps, dominated by a massive desk carved from a single piece of black oak. He stood by the window when she entered, his powerful frame silhouetted against the winter light. Your warnings about the east have been confirmed, he said without preamble. Our scouts report strange disturbances along the eastern borders, villages abandoned, unnatural storms. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Then you believe me now. I believe there is a threat, he conceded, turning to face her. Whether it's as dire as you claim remains to be seen. What will you do? What kings have always done, he replied, moving to the large map spread across his desk. Prepare for war. Alara joined him at the desk, studying the detailed map of Blackcrest and its neighboring territories. His plan was sound, tactically. Strengthen the eastern borders, increase patrols, stockpile provisions. But something crucial was missing. You still need allies, she said, meeting his golden eyes across the desk. Blackcrest cannot stand alone against what's coming. You underestimate my kingdom's strength, and you underestimate the threat, she countered. This isn't about strength alone, it's about survival. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of his irritation. The neighboring alphas would demand concessions I'm unwilling to give, even at the cost of your people's lives? His eyes flashed dangerously. Watch your tongue, human. King or not, I am still an alpha. Challenge me at your peril. But Alara had come too far to be cowed now. Someone must challenge you if it means saving Blackcrest. For a moment she thought she'd pushed too far. The air between them crackled with tension, his wolf dangerously close to the surface. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. a short, startled sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Still unafraid," he murmured, a reluctant admiration in his voice. "Very well, Alara of no clan. What would you suggest?" "The summit of Alphas," she said immediately. "It's in 2 weeks' time. Go. Present your evidence. Forge the alliances you need. The summit." His expression darkened. "Where I'm likely to face a dozen challengers to my throne. Then defeat them," Alara said simply. "Prove you're still the Alpha King in more than just name." Something shifted in his golden eyes, a spark of the fierce pride that had once defined him. "And you?" he asked, his voice dropping to a lower register. "What role does the little girl with the bold promise play in all this?" Alara's heart quickened at his sudden proximity, at the heat that radiated from him. "I go where I'm needed," she answered carefully. "And if I need you here?" he murmured, so close now that she could see the flecks of amber in his golden eyes. "At Blackcrest? At court?" "To what purpose?" she asked, breathless despite herself. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, perhaps to fulfill an old promise. Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. King Kale stepped back, the moment shattered, his expression closing like a book snapped shut. "Enter," he called, his voice once again cool and controlled. Commander Lyra strode in, her face grim. "Forgive the interruption, my king, but there's been an incident at the eastern outpost. You're needed urgently." The change in him was immediate. "All business now. The Alpha King once more. Prepare my guard. We ride within the hour." As the commander departed, King Kale turned back to Alara, his expression unreadable. "It seems our discussion must wait. Consider yourself part of my council until my return. Lieutenant Thorne will provide whatever you need." "You're going personally?" Alara asked, concerned. "If this is related to the Eastern threat, then I need to see it with my own eyes," he finished firmly. "An alpha protects what's his. A king doubly so." Something in his words, in the fierce protectiveness behind them, resonated with Alara. For a moment she glimpsed the man beneath the crown, the wolf beneath the alpha. "Be careful," she said softly. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Always." As he turned to leave, Alara felt a sudden, inexplicable dread. "Kale," she called, using his name without title for the first time. He paused at the door, looking back at her with those golden eyes that had haunted her dreams for 18 years. "Come back," she said simply. A smile touched his lips, a real one this time, not the cold, calculated expressions he usually wore. "Is that concern I hear, Alara? For the fearsome Alpha King? For the man who spared a child's pride," she corrected. "For the wolf who saw me when no one else did." Something passed between them then, an understanding, a connection that transcended the years and changes that had separated them. Then he was gone, leaving Alara alone with the unsettling feeling that events were accelerating beyond her control, toward a confrontation none of them were truly prepared for. The threat from the east had arrived at Blackcrest's doorstep, and the Alpha King was riding straight into its jaws. 3 days passed with no word from the king or his party. Alara paced the corridors of the palace like a caged animal, her concern growing with each passing hour. The court continued its functions with practiced efficiency, but undercurrents of tension rippled through every interaction, every hushed conversation. "Something's wrong," Alara told Nyx as they stood on the balcony overlooking the palace courtyard, watching yet another patrol ride out toward the eastern border. "They should have returned by now, or at least sent word." "The eastern outposts are remote," Nyx reasoned, though her own expression betrayed worry. "Messages take time, especially in winter. Lieutenant Thorne found them there, his weathered face grave. The council requests your presence, Lady Alara." The formal address startled her. "I'm no lady, Lieutenant. Perhaps not by birth," he conceded. "But the king named you to his council before departing. That grants you certain courtesies." The council chamber was imposing, a circular room dominated by a massive round table, carved with the history of Blackcrest in intricate relief. Around it sat the kingdom's highest officials, their faces solemn, their postures rigid with formality. Lady Alara, Lord Alaric, the royal steward, acknowledged her with a stiff nod. "Please, join us." As she took the empty seat, Alara felt the weight of their scrutiny. These nobles and officials who had watched her grow from an orphaned child to the woman who had inexplicably caught their king's attention. "We've received reports from the eastern border," Lord Alaric began without preamble. The situation is concerning. The king? Alara asked immediately. A heavy silence fell over the table. Finally, Commander Lyra's second-in-command, a stern-faced wolf named Captain Vero, spoke. There's been no word from His Majesty or Commander Lyra since they reached the eastern outpost 3 days ago. The last scout to return reported unusual activity. What kind of activity? Alara pressed. Darkness, Captain Vero said grimly. Unnatural darkness, spreading across the eastern valleys. And silence. No birds, no animals, nothing. The chill that ran down Alara's spine had nothing to do with the winter air. It's happening faster than I thought, she murmured. You expected this? Lord Alaric's tone sharpened. I warned the king of a threat from the east, Alara said, meeting his gaze steadily. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly it would reach Blackcrest. And yet you arrived just days before this darkness, another council member observed, suspicion evident in his voice. A curious coincidence. Not coincidence, Alara corrected firmly. I came because I knew the threat was approaching. I had hoped to provide warning in time for Blackcrest to prepare. Prepare how? Captain Vero demanded. Against an enemy we cannot see or understand. By standing together, Alara replied. Blackcrest cannot face this alone. The king needs to forge alliances with the neighboring territories. Scoffs and murmurs rippled around the table. The neighboring alphas would sooner see Blackcrest fall than come to our aid, Lord Alaric said dismissively. Then give them reason to reconsider, Alara countered. The summit of alphas is in less than 2 weeks. If King Kael attends, if he returns, Captain Vero interrupted grimly. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but devastating. He will return, Alara said, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her heart. But in the meantime, we must prepare. Increase patrols along all borders, not just the east. Evacuate the outlying settlements. Stockpile provisions. You presume to command in the king's absence? Lord Alaric's tone was icy. I presume to advise, Alara corrected, as the king instructed me to do. Before the argument could escalate further, the chamber doors burst open. A guard stumbled in, his uniform torn, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. The Eastern Patrol, he gasped. They've returned. The courtyard was chaos as Alara raced down the palace steps. Wounded guards were being helped from their horses. Servants rushed with bandages and water. And in the center of it all stood Commander Lyra, her armor dented and bloodied, her copper hair matted with dirt and something darker. Where's the king? Alara demanded, pushing through the crowd. Commander Lyra's head snapped up, her eyes widening at the sight of Alara. You! She hissed, stalking forward. You knew what was out there. Before Alara could respond, the commander's hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her against a stone pillar. What are they? What did you bring to our kingdom? Commander! Lieutenant Thorne's voice cracked like a whip. Release her! Lyra's grip loosened, but her eyes remained wild, haunted. You didn't see them, she said, her voice breaking. The shadows, the darkness that moves and breathes and hunts. Where is the king? Alara asked again, dread pooling in her stomach. Commander Lyra's face crumpled, a look of anguish replacing the anger. They took him, she whispered. The shadows took our king. The world seemed to tilt beneath Alara's feet. Around her, gasps and cries of dismay erupted from the gathered crowd. Captain Vero stepped forward, his face ashen. Explain, Commander, he demanded. Lyra straightened, visibly pulling herself together though her hands still trembled. We reached the eastern outpost as planned. Everything seemed normal at first, but then night fell. She closed her eyes, as if trying to block out the memory. The darkness came alive, shadows that moved independently of any light source. They attacked without warning, without sound. The king fought, she continued, her voice hollow. Gods, how he fought. I've never seen anything like it, but there were too many. They engulfed him, and when they retreated, he was gone. Silence fell over the courtyard, heavy with shock and grief. Then chaos erupted, voices rising in fear and anger, demands for action, for answers. Enough! Alara's voice cut through the din. This solves nothing. All eyes turned to her, standing there in the midst of the turmoil, her face pale but determined. The king is not dead, she stated firmly. If these shadows wanted him dead, they would have killed him there. They took him for a reason. And how would you know that? Commander Lyra demanded, suspicion evident in her tone. Because I've seen them before, Ilara admitted. In the East, they take specific targets. Leaders, powerful individuals. The rest they simply kill. You knew, Captain Vero accused. You knew what we were facing and you said nothing. I told the king everything I knew, Ilara countered. But even I didn't expect them to strike so boldly, so soon. She turned to address the gathered crowd, guards, servants, nobles who had come to witness the commotion. King Kale is alive, she repeated, and we are going to get him back. How? Lieutenant Thorne asked, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. Ilara's hand went to the silver pendant at her throat, the wolf's head with amber eyes. There's someone who might help us understand what we're facing. A specialist in ancient magics. Magic, Commander Lyra scoffed, though her scorn was half-hearted. What good is magic against shadows that devour light itself? Every darkness has its weakness, Ilara replied. We just need to find this one's. Captain Vero stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute. You realize what this means? With the king absent, command falls to the council until his return, or until a new alpha ascends, Lord Alaric added, his tone carefully neutral, though his meaning was clear. Ilara's eyes narrowed. There will be no new alpha, she said firmly. King Kale will return to his throne, and if he doesn't, Lord Alaric challenged, then Blackcrest will have far greater concerns than succession, Ilara replied grimly, because whatever took your king is just the beginning. The council meeting that followed was tense, with factions quickly forming. Those who believed the king could be rescued, and those already looking toward a future without him. Ilara stood her ground, insisting on a rescue mission, rather than a mere defensive strategy. The specialist I mentioned, she explained, spreading a map across the council table. She lives here in the Whispering Woods, 3 days' ride to the north. The witch? Captain Vero looked skeptical. Those are just stories to frighten children. She's no witch, Ilara corrected. She's a scholar of ancient magics, and she may be our only hope of understanding what we're facing, and how to defeat it. After hours of debate, a compromise was reached. Ilara would lead a small party to seek out this specialist, while the rest of Blackcrest's forces would strengthen defenses and prepare for whatever might come next. I'll accompany you, Commander Lyra declared, her earlier hostility now tempered by a grim determination. I saw what took our king. I need to know how to kill it. As will I, Nyx added, stepping forward. Someone needs to keep you from doing anything excessively foolish. Lieutenant Thorne volunteered as well, along with a handful of the king's most trusted guards. They would depart at first light, racing against time and the spreading darkness. As Ilara returned to her chambers to prepare, she found Mari, the servant girl, waiting nervously by her door. My lady, Mari curtsied quickly. Forgive the intrusion, but is it true? About the king? Ilara's heart clenched at the fear in the girl's eyes. He's been taken, she confirmed gently, but we're going to bring him back. Mari glanced around, then reached into her pocket, withdrawing a small object wrapped in cloth. This belonged to my grandmother, she said, pressing it into Ilara's hand. She said it protects against dark magic. I thought, perhaps it might help. Ilara unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small stone amulet, etched with symbols she didn't recognize. Thank you, Mari, she said, touched by the gesture. I'll keep it safe. As the girl hurried away, Ilara closed her chamber door and leaned against it, finally allowing herself a moment of vulnerability now that she was alone. The fear she'd been holding at bay rushed in like a tide, threatening to overwhelm her. King Kale, the alpha who had spared a child's pride, the wolf who had seen her when no one else did, was in the clutches of a darkness she barely understood. The thought of him in danger, perhaps suffering, sent a pain through her chest so acute it stole her breath. She moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit mountains that surrounded Blackcrest. Somewhere out there, beyond the safety of these walls, he was waiting, counting on her, whether he knew it or not. I'm coming for you, she whispered to the night. Hold on, my king. Hold on. The pendant at her throat seemed to warm against her skin, a reminder of the promise that had brought her back to Blackcrest after all these years. A promise made by a child, yes, but one she intended to keep. For the little girl who had once stood before the Alpha King's throne had grown into a woman who would not abandon him to the darkness. Not now. Not ever. As dawn broke over Black Crest the next day, Alara stood in the courtyard with her small rescue party, checking supplies and weapons one final time. The air was cold and clear, the mountains beyond the city walls painted gold by the rising sun. "Ready?" Nyx asked, leading their horses forward. Alara nodded, her expression resolute. "Let's bring our king home." As they rode through the city gates, Alara felt the weight of what lay ahead, the danger, the uncertainty, the very real possibility that they might be too late. But alongside that weight was a determination that burned like fire in her veins. 18 years ago, a little girl had made a bold promise to the Alpha King. Today, the woman she had become would fight to ensure he lived long enough to see that promise fulfilled. For Alara had returned to Black Crest, not just because of a childhood vow, but because somewhere along the way, the memory of golden eyes and a rare, genuine smile had become anchored in her heart, impossible to dislodge. She had told the Alpha King she would marry him when she grew up. First, though, she had to save him, and that was a promise she intended to keep, no matter what darkness stood in her way. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.